should never ever shy away from this. And yes, there may be types of jihad, but of the peak of this jihad is that which the Messenger Muhammad ﷺ spoke about, and I'll read the hadith soon. And that is fighting in the path of Allah Azza wa Jal. A physical fight, not the fighting of the nafs. Although your nafs is needed in order for your physical to go out in the path of Allah. So we're not talking about the struggle of the nafs, we're talking about the physical jihad, the physical struggling against the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to make the word of Allah Azza wa Jal the highest. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says to, which means not equal are those believers remaining at home other than the disabled and the mujahideen who strive and fight in the cause of Allah with their wealth and their lives. Allah has preferred the mujahideen through their wealth and their lives, and for those who remain behind by degrees. And to both Allah has promised the best reward, but Allah has preferred the mujahideen over those who remain with a great reward. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of the worlds, the creator of everything, is telling us who He prefers. And Allah Azza wa Jal prefers those who go out and fight in His path, and He prefers them over those who sit idle. So their rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than us who are sitting idle, or in that case anyone who is sitting idle. Their status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is different than those who are sitting, although there is also good in those who are sitting. Each of them has the reward. But Allah Azza wa Jal is saying that He has preferred those who go out in His path, in jihad fi sabilillah, He's preferred them above those who sit idle.
The claim that a real Muslim must adhere to jihad depends entirely on what jihad means within the context of the Islamic writings. And if it depends what the word jihad means in the writings, then a real Muslim must adhere to the jihad. Now, in Islamic theology, jihad, the Arabic word for struggle, striving, that could be violent struggle against the people who are against Sharia law and the Islamic way, has multiple layers of meaning. Spiritual struggle and striving, moral struggle and striving, social struggle and striving, and military or violent struggle and striving. So, to evaluate the statement honestly, we must distinguish classic Islamic doctrine, the mainstream contemporary interpretation, and the extremist reinterpretation. Without that distinction, the discussion collapses into oversimplification. But I think if you look at the Islamic writings for what they are, without trying to westernize them, without trying to delete things to give them a Western ideology, a way in which the Muslims can integrate with the West, then a real Muslim must adhere to jihad. Now, the meaning of jihad in classical Islam is a word that literally means struggle or striving, and we've heard it over and over again, and that has its context spiritual, moral, social, and military. And the traditional Islamic scholarship identifies, number one, greater jihad, the internal struggle against sin and ego, that's on a personal level, and then the moral discipline and spiritual growth that they're aiming for within that jihad. And the lesser jihad is armed struggle under specific conditions, historically regulated by legal frameworks, just war conditions, authority, limits, but there's so many instances where jihad has not stayed within those realms, and that's why it gets interpreted to be terrorism. So the subtlety of the meanings of jihad is critical, because it's not just military, it's got a crucial distinction. The distinction between spiritual, moral, social, and the military side of it. But you can't have one without the other. You can't just have the spiritual part with the moral and social part. You can't just have the military part with the spiritual part, and so on and so forth. You have to have the military, the spiritual, the moral, and the social, or you're not a Muslim. You're just playing the game. Now, point number 2, is jihad obligatory for all Muslims? Well, Islamic jurisprudence differentiates between individual obligation and collective obligation. That's why you'll see individual terrorist attacks and group more than one type terror jihadist attacks. And most classical scholars treated military jihad as a collective duty under legitimate authority, not a permanent individual mandate for every Muslim at all times. But that's not what that Muslim preacher said at the start of this video, is it? The internal moral struggle, however, is widely taught as universally applicable. Now, the moral struggle in this context could be, should I personally carry out a jihad? Because we see this all over the world. Stabbings, shootings, bombings. That could be inspired by these moral, spiritual, and social struggles. The jihad getting caught up in these struggles, individual personal struggles or group struggles that break out into a manifestation of jihad. Now, I spoke to a Muslim man about this, and this was about the Bondi terror attack in Sydney, and he said that, and I don't know if he knew what he said, but he said no, they went too early. And in that context, there must be something in the Quran, I haven't looked it up, where they are going to do a jihad all together at once. But these people broke out too early. These individual jihadists, Islamic jihadists, broke too early. I want to make a point at this stage and say there is no such thing in theology as Muslim extremism. You're either a Muslim or you're not. If you are a Muslim, you will adhere to, one way or another, jihad. That's all there is to it. If you're not really a Muslim. You're just playing a game with that title. So, groups like ISIS, they redefine jihad as a permanent global armed struggle. They ran down that path. An individual obligation and an offensive expansionist violence. Now, if a preacher comes through like the one at the start of this video and starts preaching the rhetoric that he was saying, and that I believe that was in Australia, you can take parts of that permanent global armed struggle, individual obligation to perform an armed struggle, an offensive expansionist violence mindset, which eventually, if someone's genuine enough and wants to honour Allah enough, they will break out and go early and perform what possibly could be described as a jihadist act in rebellion of the what's supposed to be coming major act of the jihad. Because some Muslim people that I spoke to said those people were not practicing the Western version of Islam. Now, the Western version of Islam would be rejected by the Middle Eastern Islamists. It would just be rejected. And so this view is rejected by the overwhelming majority of Muslim scholars worldwide. I don't know if that's true underneath, because if you're truly a Muslim scholar, I'm not, I'm a Christian scholar, but I do understand and have gotten into, as far as I wanted to invest a certain amount of time into the Muslim writings, and I've come to the conclusion that a real Muslim cannot be a real Muslim without carrying out all four factors of the jihad: social, spiritual, moral, and military. Now, extremists collapse all forms of jihad into violent activism, ignoring traditional restraints. Well, I'm sure they pray 5 times a day. I'm sure they apply the Islamic teachings in their social and spiritual lives. And that all put together equals one thing: a takeover, a military attempt to take over. That's really, when you think about it, ISIS, as much as they're trying to say that they're extremists, they're not. They're actually obeying what the Quran says. And to paint the picture of that they're extremists, that they're not bending the writings of the Islamic scriptures, if that's the way to say it, and actually carrying out what they say, that's not extreme, that's obedience, if you really are going to follow the Islamic writings. ISIS is basically just getting on with the job. They're not pussyfooting around. That's how Islam ultimately has to be. So you better ask yourself, what version of Muslim, if you are a Muslim watching this, are you? Because if you're not playing jihad in its 4 pillars, social, spiritual, moral, and military, then you're not living under the Quran type of Muslim. You're living something else under the scriptures, all of them, the ones that push this. Then we have point number 4, the socio-political dimension of jihad. Well, in modern context, number 1, most Muslims interpret jihad spiritually or socially, education, charity, or a moral form. Well, they do that because that's how they can stay peacefully in the Western world. And then armed jihad is widely considered illegitimate without state authority and strict criteria. But those state authorities and strict criteria are there and can be and are being used. As much as the Western world doesn't want to admit it. Now, the global Muslim population, nearly 2 billion, 2 billion, Australians got 30 million, we're talking about 2 billion people, is not engaged in armed conflict, which empirically contradicts the claim that violent jihad is universally mandatory. Well, jihad in the Muslim world is like evangelism in the Christian world. While everybody's called to do it, not everybody does. So if you're supposed to spread the gospel and you're not, are you a Christian? Well, you're a Christian based on believing in the finished work of Christ, not on your evangelism. You're a Muslim based on the 5 pillars of Islam. And jihad has 4 pillars of its own: spiritual, social, moral, and military. So whilst there's only a small minority that have the faith in the writings of Islam to actually carry out the violent part of the jihad, that doesn't take away the fact that it's a necessity within the Islamic writings. So, conclusion. The statement, a real Muslim has to adhere to jihad, is incomplete without defining the term. Well, we just did define that. We just did. If jihad means striving for moral discipline and faithfulness, then yes, there is a core concept in Islam. If jihad means violent global warfare, then no, there is not a universal doctrine requirement and is widely rejected by mainstream Islamic scholarships. That's a lie. Because the spiritual, moral, social, and global warfare aspects of the jihad are part of the mindset of a true Muslim. So the debate hinges not on whether jihad exists in Islamic ideology and theology, because it does, but on how it is defined individually and collectively, how it is applied, and how it is interpreted. And that's why Islam is unpredictable when it comes to terrorist attacks, because if an individual or a group decide to define that the ultimate goal for them under jihad is to carry out a terrorist attack of some kind, then they will. They just will. So there's no point watering this down or trying to pretend that Islam isn't a death cult, because it is. You can pretty it up, you can butter it up, you can doll it up. But I believe what that guy said. I believe what this preacher said. And I'll close with what he said and catch you in the next video.
We can't take away from the fact, first and foremost, that jihad is definitely part of our deen. And as Muslims, we should never ever shy away from this. And yes, there may be types of jihad, but of the peak of this jihad is that which the Messenger Muhammad ﷺ spoke about, and I'll read the hadith soon. And that is fighting in the path of Allah Azza wa Jal. A physical fight, not the fighting of the nafs. Although your nafs is needed in order for your physical to go out in the path of Allah. So we're not talking about the struggle of the nafs, we're talking about the physical jihad, the physical struggling against the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to make the word of Allah Azza wa Jal the highest. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says to, which means not equal are those believers remaining at home other than the disabled and the mujahideen who strive and fight in the cause of Allah with their wealth and their lives. Allah has preferred the mujahideen through their wealth and their lives, and for those who remain behind by degrees. And to both Allah has promised the best reward. But Allah has preferred the mujahideen over those who remain with a great reward. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of the worlds, the creator of everything, is telling us who He prefers. And Allah Azza wa Jal prefers those who go out and fight in His path, and He prefers them over those who sit idle. So their rank with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than us who are sitting idle. Or in that case, anyone who is sitting idle. Their status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is different than those who are sitting. Although there is also good in those who are sitting. Each of them has the reward. But Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying that He has preferred those who go out in His path, in Jihad fi sabilillah, He's preferred them above those who sit idle.